Encyclopedyfy reads for you. Today, 2020 United States presidential election. The 2020 United States presidential election is scheduled for Tuesday, November 3, 2020. It will be the 59th quadrennial presidential election. Voters will select presidential electors who in turn will vote on December 14, 2020. To either elect a new president and vice president or re-elect the incumbents Donald Trump and Mike Pence respectively. The series of presidential primary elections and caucuses were held from February to August 2020. This nominating process is an indirect election, where voters cast ballots selecting a slate of delegates to a political party's nominating convention, who then in turn elect their party's nominees for president and vice president. Considered a referendum on the Trump presidency, the major two-party candidates are Republican incumbent President Donald Trump and Democrat former Vice President Joe Biden. Central issues of the election include the impact of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, which has left over 220,000 Americans dead. Protests in reaction to the killing of George Floyd and other African Americans. The death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett. Climate change regulations, particularly the Paris Agreement from which Trump plans to withdraw. And the future of the Affordable Care Act, with Biden arguing for protecting and expanding the scope of the legislation, and Trump pushing for repealing or narrowing many of its provisions. Trump secured the Republican nomination without any serious opposition alongside incumbent Vice President Pence. Former Vice President Joe Biden secured the Democratic nomination over his closest rival, Senator Bernie Sanders, in a competitive primary that featured the largest field of presidential candidates for any political party in the modern era of American politics. On August 11, 2020, Biden announced that his running mate would be Senator Kamala Harris, making her the first African American, the first Indian American, the first Asian American, and the third female vice presidential nominee on a major party ticket after Geraldine Ferraro in 1984 and Sarah Palin in 2008. Jo Jorgensen secured the Libertarian nomination with Spike Cohen as her running mate, and Howie Hawkins secured the Green nomination with Angela Nicole Walker as his running mate. The winner of the 2020 presidential election is scheduled to be inaugurated on January 20, 2021. If elected, Biden would become the oldest person to serve as president at 78 years old, and 82 years old if he serves a full first term, and the first candidate to defeat an incumbent president in 28 years since Republican George H.W. Bush's defeat by Democrat Bill Clinton in 1992. If re-elected, Trump would become the oldest president ever, 78 if he serves a full second term, surpassing Ronald Reagan, who was 77 years old at the end of his second term. This is the first presidential election in which both major candidates are over 70. Procedure. Article 2 of the United States Constitution states that for a person to serve as president, the individual must be a natural-born citizen of the United States, at least 35 years old, and a United States resident for at least 14 years. Candidates for the presidency typically seek the nomination of one of the various political parties of the United States. Each party develops a method, such as a primary election, to choose the candidate the party deems best suited to run for the position. The primary elections are usually indirect elections, where voters cast ballots for a slate of party delegates pledged to a particular candidate. The party's delegates then officially nominate a candidate to run on the party's behalf. The presidential nominee typically chooses a vice presidential running mate to form that party's ticket, who is then ratified by the delegates at the party's convention, with the exception of the Libertarian Party, which nominates its vice presidential candidate by delegate vote regardless of the presidential nominee's preference. The general election in November is also an indirect election, in which voters cast ballots for a slate of members of the Electoral College. These electors then directly elect the president and vice president. If no candidate receives the minimum 270 electoral votes needed to win the election, the United States House of Representatives will select the president from the three candidates who received the most electoral votes, and the United States Senate will select the vice president from the candidates who received the two highest totals. The election will occur simultaneously alongside elections for the House of Representatives, Senate, and various state and local level elections. Demographic trends. The age group of what will then be people in the 18 to 35-year-old bracket is expected to represent just under 40% of the United States eligible voters in 2020. It is expected that more than 30% of eligible American voters will be non-white. Simultaneous elections. The presidential election will occur simultaneously with elections to the Senate and the House of Representatives. Gubernatorial and legislative elections will also be held in several states. Following the election, the United States House will redistribute the seats among the 50 states based on the results of the 2020 United States Census. And the states will conduct the redistricting of congressional and state legislative districts. In most states, the governor and the state legislature conduct the redistricting, although some states have redistricting commissions. Often, a party that wins a presidential election experiences a coattail effect that also helps other candidates of that party win elections. Therefore, the party that wins the 2020 presidential election could also win a significant advantage in drawing new congressional and state legislative districts that would stay in effect until the 2032 elections. Republican Party nomination. Primaries. In election cycles with incumbent presidents running for re-election, the race for the party nomination is usually pro forma, with token opposition instead of any serious challengers, and with their party rules being fixed in their favor. The 2020 election was no exception. With Donald Trump formally seeking a second term, the official Republican apparatus, both state and national, coordinated with his campaign to implement changes to make it difficult for any primary opponent to mount a serious challenge. On January 25, 2019, the Republican National Committee unofficially endorsed Trump. Democratic Party nomination. Primaries. In August 2018, the Democratic National Committee voted to disallow superdelegates from voting on the first ballot of the nominating process, beginning with the 2020 election. This required a candidate to win a majority of pledged delegates from the assorted primary elections in order to win the party's nomination. The last time this did not occur was the nomination of Adlai Stevenson II at the 1952 Democratic National Convention. Meanwhile, 6 states used ranked choice voting in the primaries: Alaska, Hawaii, Kansas, and Wyoming for all voters, and Iowa and Nevada for absentee voters. Issues. Impeachment. The House of Representatives voted to impeach President Trump on 2 counts on December 18, 2019. The trial in the Senate began on January 21, 2020, and ended on February 5, resulting in acquittal by the United States Senate. Effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Several events related to the 2020 presidential election have been altered or postponed due to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. On March 10, following primary elections in 6 states, Democratic candidates Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders canceled planned campaign night events and further in-person campaigning and campaign rallies. On March 12, President Trump also stated his intent to postpone further campaign rallies. The 11th Democratic debate was held on March 15 without an audience at the CNN studios in Washington, D.C. Several states also postponed their primaries to a later date, including Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Ohio, and Maryland. As of March 24, 2020, all major party presidential candidates had halted in-person campaigning and campaign rallies over coronavirus concerns. Political analysts have stated that the moratorium on traditional campaigning coupled with the effects of the pandemic on the nation could have unpredictable effects on the voting populace and possibly how the election will be conducted. Foreign interference. U.S. officials have accused Russia, China and Iran of trying to influence the 2020 United States elections. On October 4, 2019, Microsoft announced that Phosphorus, a group of hackers linked to the Iranian government, had attempted to compromise email accounts belonging to journalists, U.S. government officials and the campaign of a U.S. presidential candidate. The Voice of America reported in April 2020 that Internet security researchers say there have already been signs that China-allied hackers have engaged in so-called spear phishing attacks on American political targets ahead of the 2020 vote. General election debates. On October 11, 2019, the Commission on Presidential Debates (CPD) announced that 3 general election debates would be held in the fall of 2020. The first, moderated by Chris Wallace, took place on September 29th, and was co-hosted by Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. The debate was originally to be hosted at the University of Notre Dame in Notre Dame, Indiana, but the university decided against holding the debate as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Biden was generally held to have won the first debate, with a significant minority of commentators stating that it was a draw. Encyclopedyfy read it for you. Please help the channel with your like, subscribe, and tell us what you want your next reading to be.